Hi everyone, the lesson today is 6.3 solving using square roots. And the notes today starts off with some examples of simplifying square roots so that we can recall this process. You might recognize that the square root of 144 is a perfect square, so you could get the answer that way. But if you don't remember that, then the other way to do it is to think about numbers that multiply back together to give you 144. 144 is 12 times 12, and every time you get a double, you can take that outside as 1. And so 144, the 12 comes out in front of the square root, and so your answer is just 12. 12 times 12 gives you back 144. Number 2 is similar. You might recognize that the square root of 36 is a perfect square, but if you don't recognize that, then you can break it down. 36 is 6 times 6, and then as soon as you have a double, that can come out front, but there's already a 2 outside on this one, and so that's going to give you 2 times 6, which also gives you 12. On number 3, 180 is not a perfect square. So on this one, we're going to break it down and we're going to look for doubles. 180 is 18 times 10. And then each of those keeps going. So 18 is 9 times 2. And then 9 is 3 times 3. And then over here for the 10, 10 is 2 times 5. And then remember, all of this is still underneath a square root. But now we're going to go through and we're going to look for doubles, because every time there's 2 of something that match, it comes out front as 1. And so these 2 3s will come out in front as 1 3, and then these 2 2s will come out in front as 1 2. Remember, they don't have to be right next to each other. And so on this one, you're going to have 6 square root 5, because the 3 and the 2 that come out front multiply together, and then the 5 stays on the inside. And then on this final question, we're going to break down 128 is not a perfect square. But 128 is 64 times 2, and then 64 is 8 times 8. And remember, as soon as you get doubles of something, you can stop. This is still all inside a square root. And these 2 8s are going to come out in front as 1 8. There's already a 5 in the front. And so the 8 times the 5 in the front. And then you still have the 2 left on the inside. And so your simplified answer for this one is going to be 40 square root 2. All right, so our goal today is to solve quadratic equations. So we're solving for x by using the square root method, and there's going to be 2 times when using the square root method is the best choice. The square root method is one method of solving. We're going to use the square root method when our quadratic equations are missing the bx term. So one of the times that we're going to use them is when they're in this form ax squared plus c equals 0. And we're also going to use the square root method to solve quadratic equations when the equation is given in vertex form like this. And so there's a little reminder down here that says when you take the square root of both sides, there's going to be 2 solutions. One's going to be plus and one's going to be minus. And we'll see what that looks like when we solve the problems today. All right, so here in example 1, this is an example of an equation where we can solve it by the square root method because it has an x squared, it has a constant, but it doesn't have a regular x term. And so we want to make sure that the x squared part is all by itself, which it is. We want to make sure that the constant is on the other side of the equal sign, which it is. And this means that we're ready to solve for x. And so for this one, we're going to take the square root of both sides. There are 2 numbers that make this equation true. If you do 3 times 3, you get 9. But if you do negative 3 times negative 3, you also get positive 9 as your answer. And so that's why when we take the square root of both sides, the square root of x squared gives us x. And then the square root of 9 gives us positive 3 or negative 3. And so you'll see the answer written like this a lot with the plus or minus sign. There's 2 answers that make this equation true. One of them is positive 3 and the other one is negative 3. All right, we're going a little bit out of order here. Sometimes you're going to have to do something first to get the x squared part all by itself. So for example, on C, before I can take the square root of both sides, I'm going to have to divide both sides by 2 to isolate the x squared part of the equation. So when I divide both sides by 2, I'm going to get x squared is equal to 8. And now I'm ready to use the square root method where I take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared cancels out, and so you just have an x on this side. And then on the other side, you have plus or minus the square root of 8. And so sometimes you're going to be done right here. 8 doesn't have a perfect square, but it does have perfect squares hiding inside of it. And so we need to break down the square root of 8 to figure out what it turns into. And I'll do that work over here on the side. So the square root of 8 is 4 times 2, and then 4 is 2 times 2. And so all of that's happening right inside the square root still, but the two 2's that you see right here, they can come out front together. And so the final answer for this question is going to be x is equal to plus or minus 2 root 2. And so the part that made this one be a little bit different is that we had to come over here and we had to simplify the square root of 8 because 8 had perfect squares inside of it that needed to be simplified. All right, moving on to example B. On this one, there's nothing that I need to do to isolate the x squared, but on this one, when I take the square root of both sides, the square root of x squared cancels out, so you just have x over here. And then I have plus or minus the square root of 5 over 7. But this one's going to require a little bit of work to simplify the square root of 5 over 7 because remember, we can't have a square root in the denominator. So the first thing I'm going to do is break it up into two pieces. So it's the square root of 5 over the square root of 7. And then I'm going to rationalize the denominator by multiplying this by the square root of 7 over the square root of 7. And so that's going to give me plus or minus the square root of 5 times the square root of 7 is the square root of 35. And then in the denominator, when you do the square root of 7 times the square root of 7, that gives you the square root of 49, which is the same thing as just 7. So remember, the square root of anything times itself gives you just the number that's on the inside. And so the answer for this question looks a little bit different. It's x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 35 over 7. In the final example for letter D, we also have a step we have to do first because we have to divide both sides on this one by 11. Remember, we have to get the x squared by itself first. So now it's by itself. And so we're going to have x squared equals negative 6 over 11. Since the x squared's by itself, now we can take the square root of both sides. The square root cancels out the squared. And so that's going to give me x is equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 6 over 11. And so we're going to have to do a little bit more work to clean this up, to finish it, for two reasons. Number one, we're not going to have a negative sign inside a square root. So we'll take that out as I. And then the other reason is because we can't have a square root in the denominator. And so that's going to give us the negative 1 in the numerator is going to come out as an I. And then in the denominator, I'll have to multiply the top and the bottom by the square root of 11 to rationalize the denominator. And so that's going to give me my final answer, x is equal to plus or minus I root 66, I times the square root of 66, and then in the denominator, the square root of 11 times the square root of 11 is a square root of 121, and that's just 11. And so that's your final answer for this one, I times the square root of 66 over 11. So looking at all four of these problems at the same time, some of the problems don't have many steps at all, whereas others have more steps, especially the ones where you have to rationalize the denominators. All right, so on the second page, we have a couple more examples. On these questions, sometimes they're going to have more than one step that we need to do to get the x squared by itself. So for example, on this first one right here, I need to minus the 16 to the other side. And then I need to divide both sides by 2, because remember, I'm trying to get the x squared part all by itself before I do the step of taking the square root of both sides. But now that I have the x squared part all by itself, I can take the square root and the square root of both sides. The square root's going to cancel out the squared, so that's going to give me just an x over here on the left. And then don't forget your plus and minus. On this one, it's going to be negative 1 times 8. The negative 1 will come out as an I, but the square root of 8 can simplify. So it's 4 times 2, and then 4 is 2 times 2. Remember that all of that is still happening underneath the square root, and then you're going to look for numbers that come out in pairs. And so the negative 1 will come out as an I, and then the two 2's will come out as a 2, and so our answer for this one is going to be plus or minus. The 2 came out, the I came out, and then we still have the 1, 2 left over that's on the inside of the square root. And so remember, you always want to try to simplify the numbers that are inside the square root, both by taking out negative 1's as i's, and then also by simplifying any of the numbers that are inside the square root. All right, letter B is the first example of one of these equations that's in vertex form. And so on this one, we're not actually trying to get the x all by itself. We're going to try to get the expression right here, the x minus 5 quantity squared, That's going to be the part that we want to get all by itself on this one so that we can take the square root of both sides to solve the equation. And so to do that, I'm going to start by subtracting the 4 from both sides. That'll leave us 2. X minus 5 quantity squared is equal to 96. And then we'll divide both sides by 2. And that's going to give us x minus 5 quantity squared is equal to, and then 96 divided by 2 gives us 48. So on this one, we got this x minus 5 part, this part right here, we got that part all by itself. And that means that now we're ready to get rid of the squared, and we're going to do that by taking the square root of both sides. So on this one, the square root cancels out with the squared, and so on the left, you still have x minus 5. And then on the right, we have plus or minus the square root of 48. We're almost done. We're getting there. The square root of 48 is a number that can simplify, so we're going to break that one down. It's 16 times 3, and 16 is 4 times 4. Remember that all of that is still happening underneath the square root. As soon as you get pairs, you can take pairs out front. And so this is going to give us x minus 5 is equal to plus or minus 48 turns into 4 square root 3. And then I've just got one more step I need to do. I have to get the x all by itself. And on this one, it means that I have to add the 5 to both sides to move it over, because that's what's going to get the x all by itself. And so the 5 right here doesn't combine with the terms of the expression, but the standard way of writing it, it's just going to cut in front, kind of right by the equal sign. So it's going to turn into x is equal to 5 plus or minus 4 root 3. And that's the final answer to the question. So again, we took a detour over here. We came over here to simplify the square root of 48. And then once we were done with that, we just had to move the 5 over and put it in the right spot to get our answer to the question. All right, letter C is really similar to letter B, except we have to deal with a negative in this one. So again, I'm going to add the 3 to both sides because I'm trying to get the part with the x all by itself. And then to get the part with the x all by itself, I'm going to divide both sides by 5. So that's going to accomplish getting this part all by itself. X plus 3 quantity squared is equal to negative 1. And so now to solve it, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. The square root cancels out the squared, so I'm going to have an x plus 3 on this side. The square root of negative 1 is just I, because the negative 1 comes out as an I. And then the square root of 1 is 1. Just don't forget the plus or minus. And then we'll minus the 3 from both sides. And again, the negative 3 is going to cut in front of the plus or minus sign, because that's the standard way of writing our answer to the question. And so this one is going to turn into x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus I. And then you guys down here, this last one, letter D, on this one, we're also trying to get the x plus 6 part all by itself. So we're going to start out on this one by dividing both sides by 2. Because that's going to give me x plus 6 quantity squared is equal to 9. And then the next thing I'll do is I'll take the square root of both sides. And so on this one, the squared cancels out the square root, so you're going to have just the x plus 6 over here on the left. But then over here, this one's a little bit different because the square root of 9 is a perfect square. The square root of 9 just gives you 3. But when you write the answer, make sure you write it as plus or minus 3. I'll come over here just to show that to be consistent. So the square root of 9 is 3 times 3, but it's underneath the square root. It's not really important to show this work for perfect squares, but just so that you can see where that 3 came from. And then to finish it, we're going to minus the 6 from both sides, and the negative 6 will cut in front of the plus or minus. But there's a little bit something different with how you write your final answer to this question, because we can do negative 6 plus 3, and we can do negative 6 take away 3. And so we'll show both of those out to get the 2 answers to the question. I like to do it with arrows. So I'm going to do one option is negative 6 plus 3, and then the other answer is going to be negative 6 minus 3. Negative 6 plus 3 gives you negative 3, so that's one answer to the question. And then negative 6 minus 3 gives you negative 9, so that's the other answer to the question. So our final answer for this one, since we can split it off and actually figure out what both of them are, we're not going to write the answer with a plus or minus, because we could continue simplifying them to get the answer to the question. And that'll happen anytime the number underneath the square root comes out as a perfect square. There's a word problem at the end of today's notes that's good for us to practice. It says there's a function right here, gives the height in feet of a ball that's dropped from a height of h naught, that's the little 0 right there next to the h, after t seconds. And so on this one, it tells us that the ball is dropped from 4 feet, and so 4 feet is going to be our h naught. So we're going to plug in the 4 right here for that number. And then it says, after how many seconds does the ball hit the floor? And so it's important to notice that the floor would be when h of t is equal to 0. And so we're going to plug a 0 in for this, and then we're going to solve it for t. We're going to figure out how many seconds it would take for the ball to hit the floor. And so the equation that we start with says h of t is equal to negative 16 t squared plus h naught. And then we're going to put in those two numbers. So we'll put in a 0 over here because we want to know when its height above the floor is 0. We want to know when it hits the ground. And then negative 16 t squared. And then it says that it starts off 4 feet above the ground. So that's going to be plus 4. So we're going to solve this by the square root method, the method we're practicing in the notes today. And so let's make it look the way that we're used to having it look. You guys, right now the 0 is over here on the left-hand side, but I think that we tend to do better when the 0 is on, I think that we tend to do better when the 0 is on the other side. So you can either scribble it out and just move it over here, or what some people might prefer to do is they just take the equation and they kind of flip it around. So they move the negative 16 t squared plus 4 first, and then they take the 0 and they move it over here. It's kind of like these two sides of the equation are just changing places because it makes more sense for students usually. It makes more sense for students to have the equal 0 be over here on the right-hand side. All right, we're going to solve this by the square root method, so that means that we want the t squared part to be all by itself. So we're going to minus the 4 from both sides. That'll give us negative 16 t squared is equal to negative 4. And then we're trying to get the t squared part all by itself, so we're going to divide both sides by negative 16. And that gets the t squared part all by itself, but let's simplify over here. A negative divided by a negative is a positive, and then the other thing we can do is that both of these divide by 4, and so we can simplify that fraction. So it's going to give us t squared equals 1/4. And then we're doing the square root method, so we have the t squared part all by itself now. And so we'll take the square root of both sides. And we're not going to forget our plus or minus, so that comes next. You're going to notice on this one that the square root of 1 is 1 times 1, and the square root of 4 is 2 times 2. Don't forget the plus or minus. And so on this one, we're going to get t is equal to plus or minus 1/2. And that would be our answer to the question, except because it's a word problem and it wants us to know after how many seconds does the ball hit the floor. Even though this is two answers, t is equal to positive 1/2 and t is equal to negative 1/2, we actually go back and we just get rid of the negative answer. And we say that the answer to the question is that it's going to take 1/2 a second. Very quick. It'll only take 1/2 a second for the ball to hit the floor. So we throw away the negative answer because it's a word problem and because it only makes sense for us to consider the positive answer to the question. And so you guys, that's it. That's solving equations by square roots. So sometimes you're taking the square root of an x squared, and then sometimes, like on the following page, you're taking the square root of an expression that has an x in it. But just remember, plus or minus on all your answers anytime you take the square root of both sides.